Hashtag the girl he called just a friend. Hashtag a story of pride, heartbreak, and the crown she never wanted. Before we begin this story, I want you to take a deep breath. Because what you're about to hear is not just a love story. It's a story about dignity. About the moment you realized the person you loved most in this world didn't value you enough to tell the truth about who you were to them. It's about what happens when a woman who spent her entire life running away from her title is finally forced to wear it, not for power, not for revenge, but because she needed to remember who she was before she let someone else's fear make her small. If this story touches something inside you, if it makes you feel seen, please hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. We tell stories here that matter. Stories that stay with you long after the video ends. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Her name was Amara Celestine Adeyemi Beaumont, but nobody at Thornfield University knew that. To the students in the architecture department, to the professors who admired her quiet brilliance, and to the man she was planning to spend her life with, she was simply Amara. Just Amara. And that was entirely by design. She had chosen this life carefully. She had argued with her mother for 2 years, written letter after letter to the family council, and eventually worn them all down until they agreed to let her study abroad under a simplified version of her name, without security details trailing her every move, without the weight of a title pressing against her chest every time she walked into a room. She was 22 when she left the palace in Abuja. She was 25 when she met Daniel Whitmore at a coffee shop near campus. And she was 27 when he introduced her to his parents as, just a friend, and her entire world cracked open like an egg dropped from a great height. But let's not rush to that moment. Because to understand why those 3 words destroyed something fundamental inside her, you first need to understand who Amara was, and what it cost her to become the version of herself that loved Daniel Whitmore completely. Amara had grown up inside a life that looked magnificent from the outside and felt like a gilded cage from within. Her father, King Emeka Adeyemi Beaumont, was the constitutional monarch of a small but enormously wealthy West African nation, and her mother, Queen Isabel, was a French-Nigerian woman of extraordinary elegance and formidable expectations. Amara was the second of 3 children, which meant she existed in that particular kind of royal purgatory where she was important enough to be trained, photographed, and presented at state functions, but not the heir, which meant she was also expected to marry strategically rather than reign directly. From the time she was 8 years old, Amara had sat through protocol lessons, language tutoring in 4 languages, and endless briefings about the political alliances her eventual marriage would need to support. She had watched her older brother, Kofi, carry the weight of succession with the kind of stoic grace their father demanded, and she had watched her younger sister, Lola, dance through royal life with a lightness that Amara had never quite managed to find. Amara was the thinker. The questioner. The one who raised her hand in the middle of state dinner preparations to ask why the seating arrangement prioritized a visiting minister over a local humanitarian leader, and she was the one who got pulled aside afterward by her mother and told, very quietly and very firmly, that questions like that were for private conversations, not for the ears of palace staff. She loved her family. She needs you to understand that, because later in this story, when she chooses difficult things, it would be easy to paint her as rebellious or ungrateful, and she was neither. She loved her father, who read philosophy with her on Sunday mornings and took her concerns seriously even when the council did not. She loved her mother, who was tougher than anyone gave her credit for and whose toughness came from surviving a world that had tried to reduce her to an ornament. She even loved the palace, the cool marble floors in the early morning, the smell of frangipani in the courtyard garden, the particular quality of light that came through the tall windows in the Eastern Library. She loved all of it. She just couldn't breathe inside it. Architecture became her escape hatch, intellectually speaking, long before it became her actual escape. She had always been fascinated by the way spaces shaped people, by the invisible conversation between a building and the humans who moved through it. She believed, with the quiet ferocity of someone who had thought about something for a very long time, that architecture was one of the most powerful tools in the world because it could liberate people or oppress them without ever saying a single word. A badly designed public hospital told sick people they didn't matter. A school built without windows told children that learning was punishment. She wanted to design spaces that told people the truth about their own dignity. She applied to Thornfield University's graduate architecture program on her own, without telling anyone in the palace, using research she had done entirely by herself over 18 months. When her acceptance letter arrived, she had already prepared her argument. It took her another 8 months to win it. By the time she boarded her flight to England, she had an agreement in place: 2 years of study, minimal security presence, a modest apartment in student housing, and a strict protocol around her identity. No staff. No title. No announcement. Just Amara, a student from Nigeria, learning to build better worlds. She had been the happiest she'd ever been in her life. And then, 16 months into her freedom, she met Daniel Whitmore, and happiness became something else entirely, something deeper and more terrifying and more beautiful than she had expected. The coffee shop was called Perch, and it was the kind of place that students loved because the Wi-Fi was reliable and the owner didn't mind if you sat for 4 hours over a single flat white. Amara went there every Thursday morning to work through her structural analysis assignments, and she always sat in the same window seat, and she always ordered the same thing, and she always, without exception, put her headphones on to signal that she was not available for conversation. Daniel Whitmore did not appear to read signals. He sat down across from her without asking, set his own coffee on the table, looked at her over the rim of his cup, and said, "You have the most intense frown I've ever seen on someone doing math. Is the math winning?" She had looked up slowly, the kind of look designed to communicate that this interruption was unwelcome, and found him looking back at her with an expression so genuinely curious and so utterly without agenda that she had found, to her own surprise, that she wasn't actually annoyed. She was almost amused. Almost. "It's structural analysis," she said. "Not math. What's the difference? One tells you how numbers relate to each other. The other tells you why buildings don't fall on people." He had smiled then, and it was a very good smile, the kind that started slowly and took its time arriving. "That seems important. The not falling on people part." "I've always thought so," she said, and went back to her work. He left her alone after that. He came back the following Thursday, sat at a different table, and didn't try to talk to her. The Thursday after that, he brought 2 coffees, set one near her elbow without a word, and went to sit at his own table. She had stared at the coffee for a long time. Then she drank it. Then, at the end of her study session, she walked over to his table and said, "That was unnecessary but appreciated." "You're welcome," he said. "I didn't say thank you." "I know. But you wanted to." She had gone home that evening and sat on her balcony thinking about the particular way he paid attention. It wasn't the intrusive attention she was used to, the kind that came with cameras and titles and expectation. It was quieter than that. More careful. Like he was genuinely interested in who she was rather than what she represented. She hadn't encountered very much of that in her life, and she wasn't sure what to do with it, so she filed it away under "interesting" and went back to her work. But interesting had a way of becoming essential when you weren't paying attention. They became friends first, which she believed was the foundation of everything that went wrong and everything that went right. For 3 months, they were just 2 people who saw each other on Thursday mornings at Perch, and then twice a week, and then they exchanged numbers because he wanted to send her a podcast about sustainable urban design that he thought she'd find interesting, and then they were texting every day, and then one evening in November he called her because he'd had a difficult conversation with his father and didn't know who else to talk to, and she stayed on the phone with him for 2 hours sitting on her kitchen floor because something in his voice had told her he needed someone to stay. She learned him slowly, the way you learn a language by living in it rather than studying it. She learned that he was an engineer, that he was brilliant in the specific, technical way that her architecture brain found deeply satisfying, and that he cared about his work in the same way she cared about hers, not for status or money but because he genuinely believed it mattered. She learned that his relationship with his father was complicated and painful, that his father was a man who believed strongly in appearances and expectations and the particular kind of love that expressed itself through disappointment rather than warmth. She learned that Daniel was gentle in ways his father had never rewarded and strong in ways his father had never noticed. She learned that he was funny without trying to be, that he remembered small things she mentioned in passing and brought them up weeks later, that he had a habit of going completely quiet when he was thinking hard about something and that the silence was never uncomfortable. She also learned, slowly and with increasing alarm, that she was falling in love with him. Not the kind of falling she'd read about in books or watched in films, the sudden dramatic plunge. The kind that happens the way water rises, gradually, steadily, until one day you look down and realize you're already swimming. He told her he loved her in the spring, on a bridge over the river that ran through the east side of the city, at 6 a.m. because she'd dragged him out to see the light on the water at dawn for a photography project she was doing. He said it quietly and without decoration, the same way he did most things, and she had turned to look at him and felt something unlock inside her chest that she hadn't known was locked. She said it back. She meant it with every part of herself. For the first time in her life, she had chosen something entirely for herself. No council approval. No strategic consideration. No protocol. Just her own heart, making a decision in the early morning light on a bridge over a river, and she had believed with complete certainty that she was choosing well. She had not yet understood that love, however pure, cannot survive between two people who are not showing each other the full truth of who they are. There were signs, and she missed them, or she saw them and chose to believe they meant something other than what they meant. This is also a very human thing to do when you love someone. The first sign came 4 months into their relationship, when he took her to a work event, a firm dinner at a restaurant in the city center, professional and not particularly high stakes. She had dressed simply, the way she always dressed, in clothes that were good quality but unshowy, because one of the genuine pleasures of her life away from the palace was not having to perform through her wardrobe. Daniel had looked at her when she came out of her bedroom and said, with what she had read as affection, "You always manage to look like you belong everywhere." She had taken this as a compliment. Later, she would understand it differently. She would understand that he was noting something he couldn't quite explain, a quality she carried that he had absorbed without knowing what it meant. At the dinner, one of his colleagues had asked where she was from, and Daniel had answered before she could, smoothly and slightly too quickly. "She's from Nigeria," he said, which was true, but the way he said it had a quality of closing a door rather than opening a conversation. Amara had looked at him, and he had given her a small smile, and she had let it pass. The second sign came when she met his mother. His mother was a warm, curious woman named Patricia who had taken to Amara immediately, asking about her studies and her interests with genuine enthusiasm, and who had said at one point, looking between them both with clear pleasure, "Daniel never brings anyone home. You must be special." Daniel had laughed and said, "Mum, don't embarrass her," and changed the subject, and the evening had moved on. But Amara had caught the very slight tension in his jaw when his mother said the word "special," and she had filed it away under "something to think about later" without fully examining it. The third sign she could not misread, but she tried anyway. 6 months into their relationship, they were lying in bed on a Sunday afternoon, the kind of slow, comfortable afternoon that felt like a gift, and she had said something, she couldn't even remember exactly what, about eventually wanting him to meet her family, and he had gone still in a way that was not the comfortable still of someone thinking. It was the still of someone who had encountered a wall. She had felt it even with her back to him. When she turned around, his face had rearranged itself into something that looked like ease but wasn't quite. "Of course," he said. "When the time is right." "When will the time be right?" she asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "I'm still figuring some things out." She had not asked what things. She had wanted to, and she had chosen not to, because some part of her was afraid that asking would pull at a thread she wasn't ready to see unravel. Instead, she had laid her head back down and told herself that relationships moved at their own pace and that she should be patient and that his hesitancy was about his own history with his difficult father and not about her. She was partly right and almost entirely wrong. The day that changed everything arrived in October, almost 18 months into their relationship. They had been engaged for 3 months. Daniel had proposed on the rooftop of her apartment building at sunset, with a ring that was simple and exactly right, and she had said yes with her whole heart, and for those 3 months, she had been in the particular state of happiness that exists just before something falls. The happiness that, in retrospect, has a certain quality of light that is too sharp to be sustainable. His parents were celebrating his father's 65th birthday. A dinner party at the family home in Surrey, formal and well-attended, the kind of event where Robert Whitmore, Daniel's father, could demonstrate his professional success through the quality of his guest list. Daniel had mentioned the event a week earlier in a tone that was carefully neutral. He had said, "My father's birthday dinner is next Saturday. I'd like you to come." She had said yes immediately, happy that he was bringing her, reading it as a step forward. She had bought a new dress. She had thought about what to talk about with his father, who was, by all accounts, a man who respected achievement and precision. She had looked forward to it. She would remember every detail of that evening with painful precision for the rest of her life. The house was large and well-maintained, a certain kind of English country house that communicated old money without being a relic. There were perhaps 40 guests. The rooms smelled of expensive candles and seasonal flowers. The food was catered. The conversation was the kind that moved efficiently between professional accomplishments, real estate values, and light political opinion. She was at Daniel's side when Robert Whitmore approached them, and she had felt, in the moment before the introduction, a small current of something run through Daniel's body, a tension, a preparation. She had almost put her hand on his arm. She hadn't. Robert Whitmore was a tall man with precise silver hair and the kind of handshake that was designed to communicate authority. He looked at Amara with the expression of a man conducting a rapid assessment, and she felt, for the first time in years, the particular discomfort of being evaluated rather than seen. Daniel said, "Dad, this is Amara. She's a friend from university." The silence that followed was perhaps 3 seconds long. In terms of its impact on Amara's body and heart and understanding of the last 18 months of her life, it was infinite. A friend from university. Not, my fiancé. Not, the woman I'm going to marry. Not even, my girlfriend, which would have been a reduction but would have at least acknowledged what they were. A friend from university. As if the ring she was wearing on the third finger of her left hand under her glove didn't exist. As if the proposal on the rooftop didn't exist. As if she herself barely existed, beyond the comfortable fiction of a friendship that could be explained without complication to a man who, she now understood in one devastating moment of clarity, had not been told she existed in any meaningful capacity. She smiled. She extended her hand to Robert Whitmore, who shook it with the brief politeness afforded to an acquaintance of minor significance. She said something appropriate. She felt nothing, because the part of her that processed feeling had gone very, very quiet. The evening continued. She moved through it like a person moving through deep water. Daniel was attentive in a way that felt guilty, getting her drinks, touching the small of her back in those private moments when his father wasn't watching, trying to meet her eyes with a look that wanted her to understand without making him explain. She looked back at him each time with the calm, clear gaze that she had learned in a palace and that said nothing at all. They drove home mostly in silence. She was not a woman who made scenes in cars. She was not, in general, a woman who made scenes anywhere, and part of her understood even in that moment that this composure was itself a royal training, the ability to contain herself completely until she was in a private space where the containment could be released safely. She waited until they were inside her apartment. She waited until he had closed the door and turned around with the expression of a man who knows that a reckoning is coming and has been both dreading and knowing it was deserved. Then she said, very quietly, "A friend from university." He opened his mouth. She said, "Please don't tell me you panicked. Please don't tell me you couldn't find the words. You've had a year and a half to find the words, Daniel. You've had 3 months since you asked me to marry you to find the words. I need you to tell me the truth. He sat down on her sofa and put his hands over his face for a moment that seemed very long. Then he took them down and looked at her, and she could see that he was genuinely ashamed, which somehow made it worse.